the faithful supporters of the Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua. The left-wing government has been in power here since August 1979, and it's defending the only successful revolution that Central America has witnessed in recent years. In 1933, Augusto Sandino raised a peasant army to drive out United States Marines. His name was proudly adopted by the rebels, who now feel Nicaragua is again under threat from the United States. The Sandinist civil war cost 50,000 lives and left large sections of Nicaragua's cities in ruins. The former dictator, General Somoza, enjoyed for years the backing of the United States. He was prepared to see the country almost destroyed before he finally went into exile, only to be gunned down by assassins in South America. Today, the specter of Somoza still haunts the country. The armed forces and people's militias are on full alert in the face of two main threats: armed aggression from Somozista forces sheltering in neighboring Honduras, and the aggressive anti-communist crusade being conducted by the Reagan administration in Washington. In March, two road bridges in the north of the country near the Honduras border were blown up. The Sandinistas fear it is the prelude to large-scale armed aggression. The man behind it all, according to the Sandinistas, is President Ronald Reagan, who has revived the American tradition of supporting anti-communist forces in Central America. Reagan has cut off aid to the Nicaraguan government, alleging that it is channeling arms to the leftist guerrillas fighting in El Salvador to the north. The Nicaraguans deny this and countercharge that the CIA is plotting with exiled Somozista units to destabilize the country. An American newspaper has reported that President Reagan approved a $19 million campaign to do this. The Americans have meanwhile published a big dossier of aerial photographs to help fight the propaganda battle. The aim is to prove that there's an ever-growing Cuban and Soviet influence in Nicaragua. Work is in progress at 3 strategic airfields to lengthen the runways, allegedly to cater for Soviet MiG-21 fighter bombers when fully loaded with bombs. It's claimed that 36 new military installations have been built in the last 2 years to house armed forces now numbering 70,000. Other photos show Soviet-built aircraft on the runways. According to Washington, Nicaragua could have the best-equipped armed forces in all Central America by the end of the year. Unfortunately for the Americans, the propaganda machine was recently the victim of an embarrassing malfunction.
Mire, señor, le estoy recordando, le estoy afirmando que las declaraciones pasadas dadas en El Salvador y mantenidas a través de...
The man answering the questions is Orlando Jose Tardas, a 19-year-old Nicaraguan. He had been arrested in El Salvador, where he confessed that he had been trained in Cuba and Ethiopia and then sent by the Sandinistas to fight with the Salvadoran rebels. He was taken to Washington and invited to repeat his story at a State Department press conference.
Criminales, formas de tortura. Se me mantuve la idea de que fui a Etiopía con el ánimo de tener la oportunidad de estar ante ustedes demostrando la verdadera realidad que estoy viviendo.
But instead of confirming the story, Tardas retracted everything. He said he'd been beaten and tortured into making the confessions and given the choice of collaboration or execution. He had simply told lies in order to save his own skin.
No me importa. Primero nuestro pueblo, después cualquier cosa.
Tardas was promptly handed over to Nicaraguan officials and flown home to Managua. The American State Department was highly embarrassed and wondered whether it had been the victim of a setup. The Sandinistas, on the other hand, were delighted. They said the affair was proof of complicity between the United States and the El Salvador junta and proof that the Americans were trying to discredit Nicaragua by any means. Tardas was hailed as the latest hero of the Central American Revolution. In foreign policy matters, according to Foreign Minister Father Miguel Descoto, Nicaragua is much less aggressive than in the recent past.
Well, I think that we have to be given the benefit of a doubt as a country that has never invaded any other country, and that if ever there was an invasion into another country, it was when the United States controlled Nicaragua. And you saw things as the overthrow of the Arbenz regime in Guatemala in 1954, which was launched from Nicaragua, or the invasion against Cuba, the famous Bay of Pigs invasion, which was also launched from Nicaragua by the United States. We fought a war in order to put an end, among other things, to this interventionist thrust of Nicaraguan's foreign policy under the Somozas, the regime, of course, which was created and propped up and kept in power by the United States.
No, the British government have done.
In backing Somoza, the Americans were assured of another anti-communist strongman in a strategic part of Central America. American companies were also given full license to exploit Nicaragua's resources, such as coffee, cotton, and sugarcane. Somoza, like his father before him, led a corrupt and authoritarian regime, and the business sector, as well as the peasants, was glad to see him go. Perhaps surprisingly, the private sector still flourishes here, generating over half the gross national product and about 3/4 of foreign exchange earnings. But low market prices for commodities, combined with higher defense costs and the withholding of American aid, all mean that the economy is still struggling. It's a brighter picture on the social front. Health and education were at the top of the list of priorities when the Sandinistas came to power. Medical care and school uniforms are no longer a privilege enjoyed by the rich and powerful. A new generation is already growing up in a new spirit of social equality. And this is in part thanks to the teachers and doctors sent in by friendly countries, especially Cuba. Outside Cuba, Nicaragua is one of the few countries in the region where communist books and pamphlets are on open sale in the bookshops. But the Sandinistas insist they are creating a socialist rather than an out-and-out communist state. And they still accept the principle of political pluralism. Elections have been postponed until 1985 on the grounds that the country must first recover from the disruption of civil war. But the Sandinistas, who dominate the government, deny that they are planning to impose a one-party state. Foreign Minister Descoto explains where Nicaragua stands politically.
We are, for the first time, a free and independent nation, trying to determine our own destiny and committed to the respect of the right of self-determination of other nations and to the defense of that right as well. We do have, as you know, a rather significant number of Cuban teachers above all, which is proof of the generosity of the Cuban people that so generously responded to our plea for teachers, a plea that we sent to all of Latin American countries and Spain. And Cuba responded, as well as Costa Rica, as well as Spain. But Cuba responded even with greater numbers of teachers, and they also have got a few medical doctors, which we sorely needed then and continue to need now. I think that really what worries the United States is something quite different. They can say that they are worried about Nicaragua being taken over, that Nicaragua will not be able to determine its own destiny. Well, I would like to tell you that this is very hypocritical. Since when is the United States interested in having the Nicaraguan people determine their own destiny? How can those who in 1909 moved to remove our president and then proceeded to, over a period of years, to decide who could govern Nicaragua and to select presidents for Nicaragua, and those who brought Somoza to power and created that criminal so-called National Guard in order to keep him in power, where do they all of a sudden become concerned about Nicaragua's ability to determine its own destiny, especially now that for the first time we are pursuing a truly independent and sovereign foreign policy? I think that it is obvious that the United States is concerned about what is happening in Nicaragua, because the example of a dignified, independent policy that Nicaragua is giving could have negative effects in the rest of Latin America. For a long time, many governments have believed in our part of the world that you could not oppose imperial whims. And if Nicaragua can get away with it, that sets a bad precedent. And I venture to say that that ought to be looked more into. And I suggest that that is the key to understanding why Washington is so upset with the Nicaraguan revolution.
Washington is also trying to show
United States' tolerance of exiled Somoza supporters is an indication of just how upset Washington is with the Sandinistas. This training camp for exiles is in Florida.
Okay. Yeah.
Some call this paramilitary training center Camp Nicaragua. Others call it Camp Cuba. It's a temporary home for right-wing exiles, not only from those two countries, but also from Panama, Honduras, Venezuela, Colombia, and the Dominican Republic. Some of the exercises might look comical, but it's not advisable to laugh at these men. They are tough and deadly serious, and they get specialist training in guerrilla warfare, urban warfare, and day and night field operations. Camp leaders say 800 men have already completed training courses here, and then they are ready for the real thing, to get back to their own countries and fight as counter-revolutionaries. At least 100 Nicaraguans trained here are said to have infiltrated across the country's borders to fight the Sandinistas. Their aim is to destabilize the country, stir up internal opposition, and eventually throw out the revolutionaries. What do the exiles really think is going to happen during the next few months?
Bueno, las operaciones se están intensificando y se van a intensificar los levantamientos internos.
Well, our operations are intensifying and internal uprisings will increase. We want to improve the conditions of the people. One factor that's holding up our operations is that helping the civilian population costs us money for food and clothes, money that could be used for buying weapons. And what about the aid being sent to the Sandinistas by Cuba and other communist countries?
Bueno, definitivamente que Cuba está apoyándolos con personal militar.
Cuba is definitely helping them with military personnel, with troops and arms, and the Russians are sending in specially trained personnel. 80 pilots trained in Bulgaria, 100 men trained to operate T-55 tanks, and some MiG fighters are due to arrive this month. Libya sends money, and the Sandinistas pay them back by supplying them with passports so the Libyans can get into the United States. We have proof
proveyendo de
that people with
pasaportes
false Nicaraguan
a estos
passports
libios
are entering the USA
para que entren a
to
Estados
commit
Unidos.
who
Aquí
knows
nosotros
what kind
tenemos
of
pruebas
acts.
de que hay gente con pasaporte nicaragüense que están entrando a Estados Unidos para cometer quién sabe qué clase de cosas.
Ustedes son un grupo pequeño de hombres.
You are only a
Ustedes
small
pueden
group of
luchar
exiles.
contra
How can you take
la
on the
tropa más
largest
grande de
army in
Centroamérica.
Central America?
Eso es muy relativo. ¿Cuál es la tropa más grande de Centroamérica?
Everything is
Porque
relative.
la raíz
The
de
root
esto
of the
está
matter
en
is the morale of the
moral
troops.
de esta tropa.
We know from reliable
Nosotros sabemos
sources
de
that
fuentes ciertas
60% of the
que el
Nicaraguan army
60%
is
de
going
esta
to
tropa
join our
va a
side.
cruzarse con nosotros.
Y ustedes procuran
It's difficult to judge how much support the Somozista exiles do have inside Nicaragua, but there could be as many as 1,000 of them operating in the border region between Nicaragua and Honduras, and that's where we're heading next. The border area is home for 100,000 Central American Indians who find themselves caught up in the big propaganda war. Washington's dossier of photographs claims to show Indian villages destroyed by the Sandinistas as part of a repressive campaign of resettlement. The Americans say it's a clear case of human rights violation, making the new government more repressive than the Somoza regime. A rough dirt road leads to within a few kilometers of the Honduran border in the northeast corner near the Caribbean coast. This is one of the new villages where the government has resettled thousands of Mosquito Indians, but it's claimed it's for their own good. The Mosquitos have a traditional suspicion of the Spanish-speaking authorities, and many have resisted efforts to integrate them into the new post-revolutionary society. Exile groups have encouraged them to resist, and there have been armed clashes in the past. The Sandinista policy is to build them new homes with running water and electricity, while at the same time preventing the Indians from giving support or shelter to armed infiltrators. An American State Department spokesman made more serious allegations in March. He said that besides the forcible resettlement program, another 12,000 Indians had been driven into Honduras and others had been imprisoned and killed. That would make these Indians among the fortunate ones. Washington's propaganda war runs the risk of losing what goodwill America still has among Nicaragua's 2.5 million people. Bianca Jagger, a former fashion model, is one Nicaraguan who resents the Reagan offensive. We spoke to her.
If the Reagan administration really cared for the Nicaraguans, I think that they will behave in a different way. They wouldn't have threats going on for days after days, you know, repeating that this country is collaborating with the Russians and the Cuba, because all it does is that you end up having an emergency situation like the one we have since yesterday in Nicaragua, which is understandable when you think that two bridges have been blown out, and that there is a continuous incursions from the Somocistas from the Honduran border, and that already the Washington Post and as well Carl Bernstein have reported that it is true that the president have given already the okay or the go-ahead to go to for covert actions against this country.
So what do you think people in Britain should do?
En la defensa de este país.
Back in the capital, Managua, the people are regularly reminded of the threats from outside, and they listen intently to the junta leader, Daniel Ortega. Ortega is the only Sandinista in the three-man ruling junta. The others are a conservative and a social democrat. This formation reflects the spirit of national unity that prevailed after the fall of Somoza. But with a faltering economy and with growing pressure from exile groups and from the United States propaganda machine, Nicaragua's spirit of national unity is facing its most critical time ever. The Sandinista triumph has become Central America's isolated revolution.